Colorama, a recorded books high-bridge imprint, presents Parliamentary America, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy, by Maxwell L. Stearns, read by Maxwell L. Stearns. To my children and yours. Introduction. Happier birthdays, better parties. Imagine you're a parent to a young daughter who thankfully, along with her friends, regards your home a happy destination. Among your family traditions is hosting a New Year's Eve sleepover, which happens to be 1 month before your daughter's birthday. This year she'll turn 7. You use the New Year's celebration as an opportunity to improve her upcoming party. You ask the 11 friends and your daughter, a total of 12 children, to help choose the flavor of a birthday cake, one you might make or buy. No judgment here. And you offer 4 choices: chocolate, vanilla, red velvet, or carrot. 5 girls vote chocolate, 4 vanilla, 2 red velvet, and 1 carrot, leaving 11 girls wondering why their friend, or you as a parent, would seriously consider serving a vegetable as a birthday cake. The little girls feel strongly about all of this, and so those preferring chocolate or vanilla begin pressuring those who chose red velvet and carrot to tip the balance in their favor. You might think you'd have been better off limiting the choices to 2. And it's not too late. You could still accomplish that by having the girls list their preferences over the 4 types of cake in order. Then you could drop the flavors that get the least support one by one. First drop carrot, then red velvet, and then tally the rankings of the 2 flavors that remain, chocolate and vanilla. An increasingly popular proposal for election reform is ranked choice voting, the system just proposed, but few parents use it when planning their children's birthday parties. Now picture this instead. The girl who chose carrots says, "I have an idea. How about cupcakes with different flavors?" And you respond, "Why didn't I think of that?" It turns out there's a way to make all the girls happier. Let's return to elections. With respect to our nation's highest office, the presidency, the framers of the Constitution devised a majoritarian voting system. The candidate who received the majority of votes in the Electoral College would win. It was all or nothing. They did so because majoritarian voting was both familiar and intuitive. In middle school, and maybe high school, you might have been told that a remarkable group of men met in Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation, but instead they ditched it and wrote the Constitution. The framers believed the governmental system they constructed, based on separation of powers and federalism, would avoid factions, which we can think of as precursors to political parties. You might also have been told that the Constitution's brilliance is marked by its having long outlasted other constitutions throughout the world. That account is grounded in a larger narrative involving American exceptionalism. In that account, our unique history and our special institutions immunize us from so many challenges that other democracies have faced. There's only one problem. It's not true. In a classic scene from the 1989 hit movie A Few Good Men, Lieutenant Daniel Kaffee, played by Tom Cruise, cross-examines Colonel Nathan R. Jessup, played by Jack Nicholson, in a murder trial. In a heated exchange, Kaffee demands a candid answer, to which Jessup responds, "You can't handle the truth." American citizens are looking straight ahead at a constitutional crisis, and countering the flawed American exceptionalism narrative is critical if we're to come out of it and emerge a thriving constitutional democracy. Citizens are desperately seeking genuine solutions, and yes, we can handle the truth. True, our constitutional system has endured longer than others throughout the world. For several reasons, our nation thrived despite our Constitution's flaws. Geographic isolation, a steady and constant influx of immigrants, westward expansion with tremendous pain imposed on displaced Native Americans, and the profoundly tragic forced labor of enslaved persons brought and maintained here in truly unimaginable conditions. It's past time to recognize that to the extent the story of our nation is exceptional, it's in spite of, not because of our constitutional design. This is especially so for our electoral system and system of executive accountability. You might think of this counter-narrative as a hypothesis. There's a way to test it. Ask yourself which electoral systems have been widely replicated across the globe. The answer is clear: not ours. We've been very powerful in exporting democracy, just not our form of democracy. By contrast, other systems, those characterized by proportional representation and parliamentary selection, have been widely embraced throughout the world. There's an important reason why. Those systems, like the girl who chose carrot, recognize there's no need for all the children to enjoy or suffer a single flavor cake or even the choice of two flavors. The majoritarian winner doesn't always have to get everything. Parents can throw better birthday parties, making their children happier. And we can produce a stronger and more responsive democracy with more and better political parties for ourselves and future generations. American democracy is in crisis. We are racked with growing polarization, a lack of confidence in our most basic institutions, and a gnawing sense that the true justifications for political and legal decisions are routinely masked beyond recognition. Political leaders decry the legitimacy of the very institutions through which they gained power. At the same time, growing numbers of people who regard our democracy as under threat are also convinced it's so damaged that it can't possibly be repaired. Many serious ideas for constitutional reform are being proposed. Among the most popular proposals are ranked choice voting, like sequentially eliminating birthday cake options and allocating preferences over the remaining choices, eliminating the Electoral College in favor of the national popular vote, enlarging the House of Representatives, at-large voting in multi-member congressional districts, eliminating or bypassing the Senate, imposing term limits on members of Congress, and imposing term limits on U.S. Supreme Court justices. Determining which proposals might resolve the crisis we are facing is a serious challenge. I've been teaching constitutional law for over 30 years, and I promise to be honest with you. I can't predict when we might hit the inflection point that will require making ultimate choices over the menu of proposals. It might happen soon, in a few years, or perhaps after you and I are no longer living. There's no way to know. Constitutional crises don't happen in a moment, and they aren't necessarily resolved in dramatic fashion. They can fester for years, even decades. Here's what I can tell you. Most high-profile proposals, including those I've mentioned, won't end our constitutional crisis. Yes, proportional representation is an important part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution. And the most popular proposals for infusing proportional representation are unlikely to succeed. I agree that our democracy is in crisis. I wrote this book for those who remain hopeful, as I am, that it's not too late to fix things. In the following, I provide a comprehensive analysis of the failings of our democracy rooted in our history, constitutional structure, and the special challenges posed by the information age. After providing you with a toolkit letting you better understand how competing democratic systems function, we'll travel the world. The heart of this book is a tour of several present and former democracies. We'll candidly assess the strengths and weaknesses of competing systems and learn how to adapt the best features as our own, and I'll explain how and why this can be done. For now, let's go back to New Year's Eve. This time, imagine those little girls divided over different flavors of birthday cake as political parties. Our goal is to figure out how best to harness their energies to improve other decisions they might make, not about a birthday celebration, but about governance. The choice between vanilla or chocolate, like Republican or Democrat, provides too few options. We'll also see that democratic systems can fail by offering too many options. As with Goldilocks and the Three Bears, a central question for democratic reform is how to get things just right. We must first get past the idea of American exceptionalism. We must open our eyes to a simple fact. There are important aspects of democracy that other nations do far better. We must be open to reframing what the framers framed wrong. Some say every journey begins with a first step. Writing this book was a long journey. It required this author, a professor who has spent a career teaching constitutional law and economics, to explain in a clear and accessible manner the causes of our democratic crisis and the strengths and weaknesses of alternative electoral systems and systems of executive accountability. Because you're listening to this, you're concerned about our democracy and finding a path forward. I've written this book for you. I'll be taking you on a world tour. As this book goes to press, political events are rapidly evolving in virtually every nation we'll visit: England, France, Germany, Israel, Taiwan, Brazil, Venezuela, and here at home, among others discussed along the way. Even so, the insights I convey in the chapters that follow, helping to explain competing political systems and how we can adapt their best features as our own, will remain decades from now. The framings I offer in this book will outlive current political events. To save our democracy, we need an educated citizenry capable of seeing with clear eyes the serious challenges we face. Voters must understand that when people use terms like democracy, parliamentary government, and presidentialism, they're speaking in broad generalities that inevitably overreach. It's essential to grasp differences across actual systems and to appreciate how and why competing democratic institutions work as they do. There isn't only one system of democracy, parliamentary democracy, and even multi-party democracy. There are several competing systems of democratic government, and every single one of them is flawed, even anti-democratic in some important way. This, too, is something our educated electorate must come to understand. This book will help you appreciate the distinguishing characteristics of these systems, their differing strengths, and their inevitable imperfections. You will not only learn how and why alternative democratic institutions work as they do, you will gain invaluable insights into what has worked and what has failed in the United States throughout our long history. But more than anything, you will come away uplifted, knowing what we can do and must do to make our system work better. We can produce a thriving parliamentary America. To do so, we must embrace reforms along two axes: how we elect members to the House of Representatives and how we structure presidential accountability. I'll demonstrate that reform along either axis alone cannot extricate us from the crisis we face, and why reforms focused only on voting protocols aren't worth the candles. Even before the first step, the most important journeys begin with a leap of faith. That includes continuing to listen. My ask isn't small, but it's essential. I want you to join the ranks of thoughtful citizens, not merely frustrated with the challenges our nation faces, but also armed with an understanding of why and what to do. Unless we take radical steps to transform our democracy, our children and grandchildren might not continue living in the United States as we have long known it and as we aspire for it to become. Together we can fix this. To begin, we must be willing to learn from the experiences of others, and sometimes we have to listen to quieter, more thoughtful voices, like that little girl. Part 1. How we got here. Chapter 1. The Third Constitutional Crisis. We are a nation in crisis. Our constitutional system is broken. Without radical reform, the United States risks the fate of so many other democracies throughout history: collapse or dictatorship. The threat is genuine and existential. Many see the crisis. Few know how to fix it. I propose 3 specific reforms, each corresponding to a constitutional amendment that together can save our constitutional democracy. My proposal is radical, introducing changes along 2 axes. First, the system for electing the House of Representatives, our lower of 2 legislative chambers, and second, the system of executive accountability, meaning how the president and vice president are chosen and how the president may be removed. These amendments double the size of the House of Representatives, with half continuing to be elected by district, a new cohort elected by party, and the entire chamber based on proportional representation. The amendments transform the processes by which we choose the president and vice president, incorporating features of parliamentary democracy. And finally, the amendments provide a new mechanism for presidential removal based on maladministration. Reform along both axes, electoral rules and executive accountability, is essential. There are several additional important details, and I will explain them. Some critics will claim that this proposal is too radical. Others will claim that it's not radical enough. I hope to convince you that what I'm proposing, Parliamentary America, is the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy. I also hope to persuade you that the unique features of my proposal make it more politically viable than most proposals that have gained considerable attention yet cannot accomplish their goals. Beyond all that, I hope to enlist you in persuading others to rethink constitutional reform so that our children and grandchildren may live their lives in a thriving constitutional democracy. Rock, paper, scissors, and the unicycle constitution. In classrooms across America, children learn that the framers of the Constitution constructed a system we call separation of powers. A central tenet is checks and balances. This means that each of the 3 branches, the legislature or Congress, the executive or the president, and the judiciary, and most notably the Supreme Court, jealously safeguards its prerogatives against encroachments by the other branches. Consider the childhood game of rock, paper, scissors. Paper covers rock, rock smashes scissors, scissors cut paper. What makes the game work is that no option invariably wins or loses. For whichever option a child selects, separating the middle and forefinger for scissors, a flattened hand for paper, or a fist for rock, each player has a 50-50 chance of winning. It's a game of pure chance. The framers envisioned a rock, paper, scissors constitution, with some added tweaks. Teachers convey this when they describe a government comprising 3 co-equal branches. As in the childhood game, a co-equal branch can't always win or always lose. School children also learn that our system rests on federalism. Each of the 50 states jealously safeguards against encroachments by the federal government, and the federal government likewise resists encroachments on the powers it claims. In this happy story, the framers constructed a complex system resting on 2 forms of never-ending rivalries. Institutional rivalry pits the branches of government against each other, and geographic rivalry does the same for competing state or regional interests and between states on one side and the federal government on the other. The childhood game creates a peculiar dynamic. Scissors defeat paper, cutting it, and paper defeats rock, covering it, implying that scissors should also defeat rock. When children move from middle school civics to math, they learn that this is called transitivity. 10 is greater than 5, 5 is greater than 2, and yes, 10 is greater than 2. But not all relationships are transitive. Some relationships instead produce a cycle, including this childhood game. Scissors defeat paper by cutting, paper defeats rock by covering, and yet rock defeats scissors by smashing. The framers' game is even more confounding. Imagine the children layering on another set of rules. Sometimes paper covers scissors, rock punctures paper, and scissors sit on a rock. This too thwarts transitivity, producing a cycle just in the other direction. Scissors defeat rock by sitting, rock defeats paper by puncturing, but rather than scissors defeating paper by cutting, this time paper defeats scissors by covering. By combining both sets of rules, each option can now defeat or be defeated by any other. In this cycling game, it's more helpful to envision a unicycle than a bicycle. When riding a bicycle and pedaling backward, you still move forward. In this game, though, as on a unicycle, when you pedal forward, you cycle forward, and when you pedal backward, you cycle backward. A better characterization than a rock, paper, scissors constitution may be a unicycle constitution. Here's how it works. The president can veto bills. Congress can override a veto. The Supreme Court can strike down a federal statute as unconstitutional or construe it narrowly. Congress can start the constitutional amending process to restore the statute or amend the statute to broaden its reach. The Supreme Court can strike down the president's favored legislation or executive orders as unconstitutional. The president can appoint Supreme Court justices, hoping for better luck the next time around. And so the unicycle constitution works like this. Congress defeats the president by overriding, the president defeats the Supreme Court by appointing, and the Supreme Court defeats Congress by striking, producing a forward cycle. And yet, Congress defeats the Supreme Court by amending, the Supreme Court defeats the president by striking, and the president defeats Congress by vetoing, producing a backward cycle. Each branch can defeat or be defeated by any other branch. Oh, and one more thing. The Supreme Court decides whether the states or the federal government have exceeded their powers, starting the unicycle game backward or forward all over again. The framers extolled the virtues of endless unresolved tensions. They believed that these complexities, no one always winning or losing, would promote compromise and avoid entrenchment. If a group, or what they called a faction, loses today, that's okay. There's always tomorrow. And since the institutional actors will play again and again, those who are high-minded, looking to benefit society rather than narrow interests, will far more likely succeed. Rather than promoting fixed rivalries among what they called factions or we call parties, the framers imagined that the system they created would be fluid. Shifting alliances with endless unresolved tensions would encourage accommodations or play in the joints. And, this is key, the game doesn't only benefit the players, instead it helps all of us. The Supreme Court has reinforced these lessons, relying on the Federalist Papers, a series of essays written to get the Constitution ratified. Justices Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor emphasized that separation of powers and federalism aren't designed to protect the branches of government or the states. Instead, these features, the unicycle Constitution, are designed to protect us all. An uncomfortable truth. As a professor of constitutional law for over 3 decades, I've taught thousands of students from across the United States and around the globe. Over the past several years, I've found myself compelled to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. As familiar and perhaps appealing as the preceding account of how our constitutional democracy operates might be, it's simply false. Separation of powers and federalism do not describe how our government functions. This has become especially true in the information age, a period that began in the early 1990s. Checks and balances and separation of powers have yielded to fierce partisan loyalties among Republicans and often intense fragmentation and infighting among Democrats. Neither party can effectively govern. Few, if any, politicians are committed to separation of powers or federalism as a consistent matter of principle, although politicians claim to be when it suits them. Instead, they are committed in varying degrees to one of two dominant parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. The divisions separating the parties have grown so sharp and our politics so closely divided that Congress has become dysfunctional. Along the way, the Supreme Court, an institution designed not to be political, has become our nation's most coveted political football. Rather than compromises arising from shifting coalitions affected by checks and balances and federalism, we experience ever-widening policy swings based on which party takes control of the White House in increasingly combative elections. Executive orders, often met with judicial challenges, have replaced legislative compromise, even on the most pressing of matters: immigration, the border, the budget, climate change, infrastructure, the COVID pandemic, interstate travel for reproductive rights, and the list goes on. State political leaders, no less than members of Congress, pay homage to or vehemently oppose the president. The president is not merely the leader of the free world. He, thus far always he, is the leader of one of two parties upon which all political fortunes rest. Our rivalries are increasingly tribal, pitting two opposing camps in virtually endless warfare, with vanishingly few limits on the rules of battle. The framers didn't intend a two-party system. They didn't intend parties or factions at all, and yet the constitutional structures they put in place paved the way for our entrenched two-party system. We managed to accommodate this system for more than 2 centuries, but today it has failed. It is undermining our constitutional democracy and ripping apart the fabric of our society. Many media commentators and academics recognize the crisis. Virtually none have properly diagnosed the ultimate cause or prescribed the necessary cure. The way out. In this book, I'm advancing a singular claim. To survive as a democracy, we must change our electoral system and system of executive accountability. We must infuse features of parliamentary selection in choosing the president and vice president, and we must blend districted and proportional representation in electing members of the House of Representatives, the body that should be given that task. Only this will end our two-party system and let meaningful third parties emerge, adapt, and thrive. For third parties to be meaningful, they must play an essential role in forming the government. The changes I'm advocating are essential to ending the partisan entrenchment destroying our democracy and convulsing our society. I've written this book to explain why these changes are vital to our nation's continuing as a democracy and how we can bring about these needed reforms. The fundamental difference between presidential and parliamentary democracy involves the timing of coalition formation. In the United States, we have 2 election cycles. In the primary caucus cycle, the parties select their candidates for president. The winners each choose their running mates. In the general election, these candidates face off, competing for a majority of votes, but not among the electorate. Instead, they compete for a majority in the unusual institution called the Electoral College. More on that later. In our system, The coalitions that become governing parties form in the primary caucus stage, and thus before the general election. In the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?